Good morning, everyone. Afternoon in some parts of the world as well. We really appreciate you joining us today. My name is Tracy McDowell. I am the Senior Manager of Global Business Development and Charitable Funding here at NCCN. And we're thrilled to have you joining us today for the 2021 NCCN Global Academy for Excellence in Leadership in Oncology. Next slide, please. The NCCN Global Academy is really our opportunity to discuss issues in the global oncology ecosystem among peers. We really value this time and are appreciative of the experts we've gathered today who are able to share their expertise with us. Usually this meeting is done in person, and we really value the conversational atmosphere that provides. Clearly, in these times, we are virtual, but we still want to have that. We strive to achieve that same environment. So as Mark had mentioned, at any point through these conversations, please use the Q&A button to share your comments, your questions, and we'll be sure to incorporate those in the discussion today. Dr. Carlson is our moderator today, and we're very thankful to have his time to go through. We have two modules for you today. Module 1 is our global resources and meet the experts, meet the NCCN guidelines panel and collaborative experts. We'll have a short break, and then we'll be followed by our second module, which is spreading equitable and accessible cancer care through multilateral partnerships. Again, we're really thrilled to have you joining us today. And before we go into our first module, I wanted to give a baseline. Some of you have attended before, some of you may be new to NCCN global work. And I just wanted to share a few of our global initiatives with you. Next slide, please, Mark. So our focus in NCCN Global is awareness, accessibility, and relevance of NCCN resources around the world. We do this in many different ways, and our content is constantly growing, which we're really proud of. But the three ways I'm going to talk to you briefly about this morning are our regional adaptations, our NCCN framework, and our NCCN harmonized guidelines. The reason I'm talking about these today is because you're going to hear them mentioned in the first module. And so we just wanted to give you a baseline understanding of what those mean as you're hearing them discussed. Next slide, please. Our regional adaptations. We're really proud of this work, and we collaborate with regional organizations and leaders in thought in those regions to account for local accessibility of metabolic. So these guidelines are adapted to account for local accessibility, metabolic differences in population, as well as regulatory status of healthcare technology in those regions. We currently have 24 of those adaptations done for different regions around the world, and those are all available via our app or our website free of charge for providers to download in their respective regions. Next slide, we're going to talk about the NCCN framework. So this is what we've designed for low and middle resource countries. These frameworks define the appropriate treatment pathways based on available resources. So you can see we have basic, core, and enhanced. Basic is the essential services needed to provide the basic minimum standard of care. The core has all of the basics, plus includes additional services that may provide major improvements in outcomes and are not cost prohibitive. Enhanced includes all of the previously mentioned, but they may have major improvements in outcomes that are cost prohibitive. So this is a tool for physicians to use in low and middle resource settings. And as you can see, these are very widely downloaded with over 270,000 downloads in 2020 alone. Finally, and next slide, please, Mark. We have our NCCN harmonized guidelines for sub-Saharan Africa. We are incredibly proud of this effort and are incredibly thankful to have created a joint effort with NCCN, the African Cancer Coalition, the American Cancer Society, the Clinton Health Access Initiative, and the IBM Foundation. These created tiered adaptations of NCCN guidelines and the NCCN framework, representing optimal care that regions aspire to provide and pragmatic approaches to provide effective treatment options for resource-constrained settings. Currently, we have 48 published NCCN harmonized guidelines for sub-Saharan Africa, and that number continues to grow, which we are incredibly proud of and incredibly thankful for all of our partners in this work. as you can see in the blue text below, these represent 43% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa, and we're just incredibly proud of that work. And the next slide will show you how that effort has grown throughout the years since we started in 2017. So now they cover 88% of all cancer incidents in the region. This is providing very positive changes in outcomes for cancer patients in sub-Saharan Africa, and I know Dr. Carlson will speak more to that as we discuss in our first module. But I just wanted to give you an outline of, again, these are just a few of the products and services we provide on a global setting. The next slide, please, Mark. Next slide after that. There we go. And again, there's many more, but again, today we're kind of focusing on our collaborations, especially in sub-Saharan Africa and around the world. And with that, I am going to pass it off to our esteemed CEO, Dr. Robert Carlson, who will be moderating the first module. So Dr. Carlson, I'll hand it to you now. Thank you.
Tracy, thank you very much for that great introduction. I would like to add my welcome to everyone to this NCCN Global Academy for Excellence in Leadership in Oncology. We think we have a really wonderful group of experts to discuss some of the issues of global oncology today. As Tracy mentioned, we will be dividing it into two different panels. The first one is on global resources to meet the NCCN guidelines panel and collaborative experts. So if our four experts for the first panel could all come on camera. And I'd like to have each of you introduce yourself, who you are, what you're doing now, and why NCCN would have invited you to participate in this panel. So let's go in alphabetical order. We'll start with Dr. Anderson.
Thank you very much, Bob. So I'm Ben Anderson. I'm a breast cancer surgeon. I practiced at the University of Washington and Fred Hutchinson Cancer Research Center for 26 years. And I have a nice long history with NCCN. I started in 1998 on the breast guideline panel when Dr. Carlson was the chair of that panel. We developed an interest in global health, and this concept of resource stratification is something that Dr. Carlson and I got started in our organization called the Breast Health Global Initiative. Since that work has been done, I have most recently transitioned to the World Health Organization. And at WHO, I'm now leading a new effort. It's called the Global Breast Cancer Initiative. And the target of this is to address breast cancer globally and to reduce breast cancer mortality using integrated methods of public health sciences and clinical practice at the country level, focusing on the needs of low and middle income countries.
Great, thank you, Ben. And next up is Dr. Brown.
Hi, I'm Pat Brown. I'm at Johns Hopkins University in Baltimore, Maryland, where I'm a pediatric oncologist focusing on leukemia. My role in NCCN is I chair the adult ALL guideline as well as the newly developed pediatric ALL guideline. In terms of global resource, I've been involved in the framework development for the adult ALL guideline, and then more recently in the development of harmonized guidelines for sub-Saharan Africa, which was a wonderful experience for both the adult and pediatric ALL guidelines. And I'm delighted to be here today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Brown. And next up is Dr. Dungu.
Hello. My name is Dr. Henry Dungu. I hope you can hear me.
Yes, we can.
I'm a consultant hematologist, oncologist at the Uganda Cancer Institute in Kampala, Uganda. And I've been a member of the harmonized guidelines for sub-Saharan Africa. I've chaired the harmonization guidelines for acute myeloid leukemia, multiple myeloma, and other plasma cell dyscrasias. It's really an honor to be part of this tonight. Thank you very much.
Thank you. And our fourth panelist is Dr. Kumar.
Hey, I'm Shati Kumar. I'm a hematologist at the Mayo Clinic in Rochester, Minnesota. I chair the myeloma group at Mayo Clinic, and my focus is, again, early precursor disease evolution into multiple myeloma. My role in the NCCN has been as a member of the guidelines panel for plasma cell disorders initially, and subsequently as the chair of the panel. Most recently, I've been involved with Dr. Tungu and his colleagues in the most recent version of that harmonization that was done for the plasma cell malignancies for the sub-Saharan African region early this year. So it's a great pleasure to be here with this group discussing this very important part of cancer care.
Wonderful. So Ben, I'd like to send the first question on to you. You've been involved now in international guideline development for 20 plus years. So you've had a huge amount of experience in this effort. So why should we choose to think about adapting the NCCN guidelines rather than just creating new guidelines in a region from the start? What is it that we should consider in that effort? And assuming that you're going to say that NCCN guideline adaptations are important, how do we go about considering evidence, and how do we identify regional expertise and utilize that expertise in adapting guidelines like NCCNs?
Well, thank you for the question, Bob. I would begin by saying that actually a lot of countries around the world do exactly what you just said, which is they say, well, we know we need to have guidelines. Let's sit down and do that. Problem with that is it really underrepresents the complexity of quality guideline development. There's so much that has to be taken into consideration, both the high-level evidence from randomized trials and areas where there are gaps, and we need to use clinical expertise to fill in those, connect the dots. And so back in 1998, when you and I were on the breast panel, I had the opportunity to go to Ukraine. And it became quite obvious in this project that the NCCN guidelines and the ASCO guidelines, the ESMO guidelines basically didn't work in that environment, because the guidelines that were developed are based upon the ideal circumstance. You're taking all of the best evidence to say, what can we do biologically to address this disease, which is a very important exercise, not particularly easy to do. But the problem is it didn't help you when you had some but not all of the resources that were available, because it provided no prioritization. So that led to this evolution and this idea of, well, resource stratification. You have to stratify by what you have available to make functional systems. And that was really an evolutionary process that you were a critical guide in, and in helping us think through this categorization. That idea that there's some things that are essential you cannot do without. There's some things that will make major differences in improvement, and then there are other things that are helpful and may be important, but are prohibitive in some mechanisms. And so I think the reason that you begin with the NCCN guidelines is because of the high quality of that evidence. But the question then is a question of application. How do I actually bring this into the environment that has some of not all of these resources? And so therefore, I think that this idea of using resource stratification has been very important. And I really want to applaud the work that NCCN has done in taking these evidence-based guidelines and essentially like a prism. I see it sort of like taking sunlight and spraying it as a prism. It separates it out to make it applicable. The harmonization process that you then went on to do, I know we'll be talking about it later, I think was really a brilliant next step, because it's what then brings it into the region and makes it the product of the people from that region. But you're beginning with the highest quality product. That's the reason you start with NCCN.
So Dr. Brown, thank you, Ben. Dr. Brown, you have chaired both a NCCN guideline panel for the US, as well as participated in adaptations and harmonizations internationally. So, how do you consider the evidence differently when you go and do an adaptation or harmonization? How was the experience different? What's the process that's used that makes it a different product?
Well, I think that the the qualitative nature of the evidence that you're considering differs. So in the parent guideline development, most of the evidence that we're considering are clinical trial results that are published, and in top tier journals. And while those results certainly apply to the resource specification framework as well as the harmonized guidelines, the nature of the evidence that we use is really regionally based and more expertise driven. The critical factor in our harmonization efforts in particular, but also in the framework development when we had external reviewers from various resource driven external reviewers from international areas, it was really more of an expertise level of evidence rather than peer-reviewed published literature. Now, there were some cases where academic institutions within regions had published manuscripts on regionally adapted approaches, and we used those where they were available. But most of the decisions that were made collaboratively with our regional experts, such as Henry and others, was really an experiential level of evidence rather than a peer-reviewed published. I'd say that's one difference. The other thing that I would say is just to add to what Dr. Anderson has said is that really the adaptation of guidelines. What I found was so helpful about it was the aspirational aspect. So the parent guideline is the best available management of various cancers in a resource optimized setting, and to adapt those guidelines to other settings and to do so without deleting the things that are in the parent guideline allows for aspiration towards optimal. And so it's not defeatist in that it doesn't say that it would never be possible for a given region to reach that optimal. It simply says that at this time, these particular resources or management aspects are not available. However, we do not close the door on those being available in the future through policy decisions and other things like that. And then I would just finally highlight the absolute crucial contribution of regional expertise in this process. It simply would not be possible without it.
Great. And we're fortunate enough this morning to have a wonderful regional expert, Dr. Dungu, with us. So, Dr. Dungu, as you approach the harmonization process, what's it like for you? How do you take the regulatory and reimbursement environment that you practice in and the resource variability in a large area like sub-Saharan Africa? I mean, how do you bring all those things together conceptually as a regional expert to help the harmonization or adaptation process?
Well, that's a really good one. Before the harmonization, during my training when I was in the United States, I used to really look at the NCCN guidelines, and I saw them as a very important tool. But what came to my mind was they're not applicable. Everything seems to be really for the high-end countries, etc. But when we started the harmonization process and then agreeing to see how different regions could, when you find that you are not alone in the field of scarcity, you somehow start thinking, oh, maybe we can do something. Cancer care in Africa, especially sub-Saharan Africa, has been mostly done through the government system. We don't have a lot of insurance system. We don't have a lot of reimbursement issues, although they're being introduced. So it hasn't been a challenge of reimbursement. It's been a challenge of can the governments actually accept to, adapt what has been discussed in these guidelines. And for those countries that have endorsed the guidelines, we've actually changed our menu of resources that we use, most of that based on what has been recommended in the guidelines. For instance, some medicines that initially, in the first times of adaptation, we used to have blue and everything is gray. Things are being changed into another color because now in some centers, they've realized the importance of certain, for example, medicines, and they've been brought on board. So it's been a tool that we have used to really take to our leaders in governments or in these institutions to help us do the adaptations. So we continue to account to them. We continue to do evidence-based practice, but so many of these countries that are in sub-Saharan Africa are actually being extremely helped by having these guidelines in place. Now, there has been a challenge of access to the guidelines. I think it's because of lack of awareness, because many people, I think, have not been able to really reach them. But if we continue with awareness, we'll be able to reach further. But bottom line is that it's not a reimbursement issue, but it's an issue of trying to convince our leaders in the health system to borrow a leaf from these guidelines and implement better cancer care based on the resources we have. Thank you.
So Dr. Kumar, in the US, we're becoming bombarded. That's not quite the case, but we're experiencing the use of biosimilars and the encouragement of using biosimilars more and more. How have the NCCN guideline panels, the parent guideline panels, looked at the use of biosimilars, and does that give us any lessons or insight into drug availability and so forth in areas like sub-Saharan Africa? You're on mute.
It's an important aspect, of course, for the cost of care everywhere. I think even though we don't necessarily think about it in the US as much, I think, especially I think, just to what Dr. Brown and Dr. Tungo just talked about in terms of the accessibility to drugs and how that plays into the adaptation. I think the biosimilars already playing a major role and will continue to play a major role. I think in the parent guidelines, and I can speak to it from a myeloma perspective, where unfortunately we have a limited number of biosimilars at this point for use. It has not really influenced how we have, adapted or how we have actually developed the current guidelines in the US. But I think we are, where available, we have clearly made those as acceptable options. And I think as we go into the adaptations, I think that is going to be key. Clearly, some of these biosimilars are not available in the US, but they are available outside of the US. And I think that is something, which we need to take into account when we talk about that. We take that best available structure and trying to adapt to the low and middle income resource countries. We want to make sure we don't miss out on those things just because they are not present in the parent guidelines, because they might be available in countries outside of the US. And I think that's a nuance we need to keep in mind. But I think it's very, very important that we keep that in mind as we develop the adaptations. And as I think Dr. Tungo correctly pointed out, it is, and Dr. Brown said, it's an aspirational document. Our goal is to try and convert as many of those gray letters into blue letters over the time. And incorporating some of these biosimilars also provides, I think, a blueprint for how they're going to prioritize the research focus. And it doesn't always have to be replicating exactly what we have done. And especially when you have access to biosimilars, that they might be able to chart out a totally different approach to treatment of a disease, which we may not have thought of, or we may have been limited in doing because of the availability of some of these drugs.
Dr. Deng, what is the availability of biosimilars in sub-Saharan Africa, and are they widely used?
Thank you for that. They're actually very, very common. Our colleagues from Asia have come to our rescue. It's quite difficult for us to get the original products, as we refer to them, in this country or in these countries, because they're quite costly. So biosimilars have been almost the way to go. Through other collaborations, the Clinton Foundation and the NCCN, during these discussions, we've come up with a strategy of dealing with the manufacturers directly. And now we can, at least at the Uganda Cancer Institute, we can access many of these products, including the original products. But what has been the order of the day is use of biosimilars.
Great. So the slide that Tracy showed of the number of guidelines that have been developed in sub-Saharan Africa, as you could see, is a really aggressive increase in the cumulative number of guidelines that we have available. We've also been impacted over the last year and a half with the COVID-19 pandemic everywhere, but certainly especially in sub-Saharan Africa with limited vaccines and so forth. So, Dr. Brown, how has this process accommodated the reality of needing to continue to develop and update guidelines in the face of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Well, I would say that one of the things that I'm very proud of is and have tremendous respect for the NCCN organization, and particularly the global office, is the way that things have continued largely unabated despite the pandemic. Our guidelines, the parent guidelines, continue to be updated on the same schedule. The adaptations that have been made in this regard is that we do a lot more of this, of the virtual meetings rather than in-person meetings, in order to keep pace with the guidelines and making sure that they're updated. And that pertains to the global resources as well. And one of the things that I've just been so impressed by is the ability of NCCN, the organization, and all of its global partners to adapt to the situation the pandemic has presented. Having said that, I think the value of the meeting, I feel so fortunate that our meeting in Addis Ababa in Ethiopia to harmonize the ALL guidelines occurred prior to the pandemic. I mean, that face-to-face meeting was so important, both from, I will tell you that one of the things that happened as a result of that meeting is I came back and we made changes to the parent guideline based on things that I learned as part of that process. It's a two-way street. And that's something that I look very, very much forward to, is the ability to continue to have those face-to-face meetings, which really are irreplaceable, but just will need to be postponed until it's safer.
Yeah. Dr. Kumar, have you updated any of the harmonized guidelines using virtual technology, and what was your experience like in doing that?
I think unfortunately we were not able to get our meeting done. Unlike Dr. Brown, ours actually got canceled. We were supposed to be meeting physically. And of course, I think the importance of face-to-face meetings cannot be emphasized enough to get a real feel for the differences. But I think, the kudos to the NCCN staff. I think without blinking an eyelid, we transitioned that to a virtual meeting that was done over a couple of days. And I think it was very successful. I think being the latest amongst the adaptations that have been done for the plasma cell malignancies and the Waldenstrom's, we had, I think, a excellent set of sessions where we were able to achieve the goals with respect to the adaptation of these guidelines for the sub-Saharan Africa. I think, the same thing is applied also for the parent guidelines. I think we met our schedule. We were able to actually get very good participation at the virtual meeting. And in fact, the last iteration of the myeloma guidelines, there were quite a few changes. In fact, in addition to some of the content changes driven by the new drugs and so forth, we made some fundamental structural changes in terms of how we organize the therapies for this disease. Again, just reflecting the number of therapies that have become available over the past few years. So I think we were able to continue the work without really affecting the quality or the timeliness of the updates. But again, I think going back to the point of the adaptation and the value, I think it really opened the eyes, my eyes, even despite having seen a lot of the medical issues in India where I trained. What can we get away with still still giving the best care possible for the patients, and also what's the best we can do in terms of all the resources. I think I think even if you're not involved in the process, I would strongly encourage people who are practicing in the US to look at both versions and see the difference in practice, still achieving most of the goals that we want in terms of patient care.
Great. Yeah, what we've seen at NCCN in terms of that, and thank you both for the compliments. The COVID-19 pandemic has really forced what I would call change acceleration. It's totally changed the pace of change, and things at NCCN headquarters that historically would have taken probably 6 months for us to figure out and anticipate, we actually accomplished in 2 or 3 hours. I don't think we can keep that pace up. You can't run a marathon at a sprint's pace, but at least over the short term, we've been able to, I think, to accommodate the needs of our various constituents. So that's fantastic. So, and Dr. Dengu, tell us about what's happened in cancer care in sub-Saharan Africa with the pandemic. What's happened with diagnosis, what's happened with treatment, what's happened with follow-up. How have the systems been impacted by the pandemic?
Well, it's been greatly affected. Today, I was in our biennial cancer conference. It's the third Uganda conference on cancer and palliative care. And for the first time, it has been done virtually. We had the Director General of the WHO deliver his keynote address online, recorded and then submitted. We've been so much affected, so much. With all these challenges of fear, of getting sick of the disease, the challenges of restrictions to movement, when we get these total lockdowns, many of our patients got stuck at the various treatment centers. There were no public transport systems to take them back. We did not have anywhere to accommodate them. So we really were hit by this. But it's been also a good idea because innovations have come up. We have continued to run our tumor boards virtually. For instance, we have our lymphoma tumor boards every Thursday, and we link up with colleagues in Seattle, with colleagues in Guatemala, with colleagues in Northern Uganda, and we all link up. We are able to discuss other histology types, again, by use of virtual connections. So through these challenges, we've actually come up with innovative ideas that have helped us to keep afloat, to keep surviving. But bottom line is that, yeah, it has been a tough one. It is still a tough one. We are not able to meet. Many times when you have a physical meeting with colleagues, the number of things you learn, it also helps you to change the environment and see what is happening somewhere else. By the time you come back to your desk, you have better ideas sometimes. So those have been the issues. The other challenge you've had is that, a country like mine, or many countries in sub-Saharan Africa, we did not plan for the pandemic. We did not have systems such as, these Zoom connections. We did not have a fully established internet system. That's why many times when you're on such meetings, we keep dropping off because of the instability of the system we have. You cannot rely on your phone to keep discussions, and many of us have been running our meetings using phones. So those have been some challenges that we hope can get probably dissolved, and then in case such situations continue, we'll be able to cope. I submit.
Yeah, we in the United States have certainly experienced some changes in the way that we interact with patients and practice as a result of the pandemic. Dr. Brown, do you want to talk about perhaps what some of those changes are, the ways that your practice has been impacted or changed relative to the pandemic in cancer care?
Yeah, so within pediatric oncology, I would say that the initial impact was substantial, where we turned to telemedicine for, maybe 50-60% of our visits became virtual and telemedicine. And it took, a couple of weeks to really get that system up and running through our existing electronic medical record and what have you. We were fortunate that the impact of the pandemic is so regional within the US. And I live in the Middle Atlantic region, in an area that's been where vaccination rates are high and where mitigation measures have been successful to the point where it hasn't impacted our hospital capacity. We've been able to continue to deliver the same care that we otherwise would have. We've now gone back to, I would say, 80-85% in-person visits. We continue to have telemedicine be part of what we do, and we've learned that for certain types of visits, it actually works better than in person, and there's a lot of satisfaction both from the medical side and from the patient side with that. So, I think we've been very fortunate in my area, and both because we're in pediatrics, where the impact of the pandemic on our age group as a whole has been less than in the adult space, but also because of the region of the US that I live in, and the mitigation measures that have been readily adopted there compared to some other parts of the US, I would say we've been relatively.
And Dr. Kumar, what's your experience in the adult population?
Yeah, it just reinforced that change is a constant thing, and it's been a pattern of changes over the past 18 months. But I think it has been the initial part. We kind of switched rapidly into doing most of the visits virtual, trying to get patients to stay closer to home, getting tests done at home, sending results to us so that we can manage them more remotely, trying to switch to drugs which are more oral so they don't have to visit the clinics, trying to delay stem cell transplants as much as we can where it's possible. Now, I think through the kind of the middle, that 6 months, I think things kind of evolved back into more towards normal as we better understood, the impact of the disease on the COVID as well as the COVID on the disease. And I think especially the past 9 months, once we had the vaccines available, they have become available. I think we have slowly gone back to our older practice structure. In fact, as Dr. Brown pointed out, the same numbers for us, nearly 80 to 90% of our visits are currently face-to-face, and the remaining 10% virtual are often the patients who really never needed to come back, maybe on that regular basis. So I think it certainly taught us some new things, how we can alter our practice for the future. And hopefully some of those lessons learned will stay with us. But if it weren't for the mask that we wear every day, I mean, I could be sitting in a patient room for the whole day and may not even remember that we are living in the middle of the COVID. But it certainly has kind of evolved back to where we were with, of course, with all the important practices with social distancing and masking.
Dr. Dengu, my experience in my visits to Africa has been that the transportation systems for patients are challenging to get to the treatment center and back home, and especially on an urgent basis when something important comes up. And at the same time, you've outlined the challenges of the technology infrastructure, so that telephone systems, internet systems, and so on are not quite so reliable. So, in the U.S., as you just heard, when we were faced with the inability to see patients face to face, especially early in the pandemic, we had technology to fall back on. How is it? What's the experience been like for you? Have you done telemedicine in sub-Saharan Africa? What's your experience there?
Well, that is something that is totally new, and we have not done that. We have no mechanism to follow up on a patient in their home virtually. We sometimes try to make phone calls, especially for study participants, but to talk about how I'm feeling, and we don't have the necessary resources to do that. So it's a big challenge. And actually, talking about the infrastructure challenges, we had so many patients that failed to make it back for review during the times of the lockdown. And many of them actually died in their communities because they didn't have a way of coming. Remember, we had total lockdown, we didn't have public transport, and even at some time, if you had private transport, it was not possible. It was only after you get permission from the local leaders that you would come in, and in case of an emergency, it was extremely difficult. So this impacted us a lot. Still doing that because up to now, travel is a big, big challenge, and many people are not able to come into clinic as they used to do. So the issue of telemedicine has not yet worked for us.
And that must be especially challenging for you, given the fact that the cancer centers are.
It is, and actually,
usually there's just one or two per country.
For instance, in Uganda, as a national strategy, we have come up with discussions with government to set up regional centers, small cancer treatment centers that are within the regions, so that people with less complicated cancers can be seen from within their regions, and then those that need further referral are sent into the main referral center.
Is that going to be sustainable after the pandemic?
Well, actually, we are looking at the future. Even if the pandemics continue, we want to make sure that cancer care reaches to the people. That is what is looked at as probably the long-term strategy.
Okay. So there was some mention earlier of the impact of the regional adaptations, harmonizations, framework discussions, and so on with the international colleagues, and how that has provided a feedback loop to the parent guideline panels. Dr. Kumar, are you aware of any changes that have been made to your guideline as a result of your experiences interacting in this process with our international colleagues?
We haven't made any major changes, but I think there are, it certainly influenced, I think, the direction of the discussion we had recently with the parent guideline update, mostly in terms of the prioritization of the tests that we order for many of these the diagnosis and follow-up of plasma cell malignancies, particularly, I think, categorizing them into the ones that we need in certain circumstances versus the ones we think we should always do. And I think certainly it gives a different perspective on the things we've said. We always thought we always have to do it. Now we think maybe not always, maybe sometimes we can avoid some of those testing. So I think it's going to be a continuing dialogue and bidirectional change over time. But certainly it's an important principle. I think we need to adopt across all parent guidelines.
And Dr. Brown, what's your experience in that regard, Ben?
I agree 100%. So it was in the diagnostic area that I found that just there were some very pointed questions asked of us by our international colleagues as to what's really the value of that. And going back to the panel and saying, is there really value in this thing that we do? Is there evidence to support, this testing? And in some cases there simply wasn't, and it allowed us to streamline our parent guideline in a way that was very helpful. The other thing I would say is sometimes the logic of our algorithms, where just getting a different set of eyes on some of our basic treatment algorithms was really helpful and helped to identify some inconsistencies or some gaps in logic that we were able to bring back to the guidelines. So I found it extremely helpful. I think anytime you get a different set of eyes on your guideline, it does nothing but lead to improvements.
Yeah, just a couple of weeks ago, we had an adaptation meeting with colleagues in Poland for cervical cancer, and they raised a question about a surgical recommendation that was in our parent guideline that they thought was perhaps not consistent with current data. And when it was actually looked at, that data came from Europe, and part of the challenge really appeared to be regional biases in how we interpret scientific data. And at the conclusion of the discussion, the chair who was with us, Dr. Rustam, said he was going to be going back to his panel and recommending a change. So yeah, it is a two-way street. So Dr. Anderson, again, you've had this longitudinal experience with parent guidelines. You've done situational analyses in South America, in Africa, probably in Seattle as well. Talk to us about the framework, the stratified guidelines and the harmonized guidelines, and why should we expend all the effort to do those as opposed to just like the traditional regional adaptations that we do at NCCN? What's the value of the different ways of providing the content?
I'd like to comment, if I could, first on the discussion we just had, because it does have to do with global health as well. I was in Seattle when the first COVID case was diagnosed in the United States. That was in a nursing home in Kirkland, which is about 10 miles from my house. And so our university had to very rapidly adapt to and say, what do we do? Because we didn't know what was going to happen, but we knew it was going to be challenging. And surgery changed a lot, certainly in terms of using virtual communication tools to talk with patients, but you actually can't do surgery virtually. That requires a physical in-person interaction. And so we had to just consider resource applications and triage. And that really wasn't something that we looked at a lot in the US. But just in breast surgery, breast cancer, the recognition that if we're not going to be able to operate on patients, taking the estrogen receptor positive cancers, putting those patients on endocrine therapy, we had very high level evidence that would allow us to spread out our ORs and defer. We're actually using that very same strategy in some projects we're proposing for sub-Saharan Africa. And because one of the criticisms that we get, to get to your question, this resource stratification, the initial reaction can be, oh gosh, you're just certifying substandard care, you're giving poorer care to poorer countries, which is a fundamental misunderstanding of resource stratification. The concept of resource stratification is about building systems, but you have to go in order and you have to have this laid out. And that, to that point that Dr. Dongo made about when you look at the NCCN resource stratified or harmonized guidelines, it shows you all of the options and then selects them and provides this prioritization scheme so that you're not talking about substandard care, you're talking about going in order. This is really important. While we may be a clinical community and we're focused on clinical medicine, that we have to be communicating with ministries of health and policymakers, because they're the ones that determine where what kind of resources are going to be made available. So something about how to go in order. So for example, there's been lots of communications about the availability of targeted therapies, molecular therapies, trastuzumab being the first one down the pipeline of what to do. And the point is that while you certainly want to think about that medication is only used in the context of where cytotoxic chemotherapy is already available. So the healthcare systems need to know this. Screening, mammographic screening. It doesn't make sense to be talking about mammographic screening in a setting where 90% of the women are presenting with tumors that are easily palpable or visible. You don't need a mammogram to determine that. You have to be able to manage the cancers that you can see and feel first. That's called early diagnosis. So this stratification concept, which NCCN has really taken in this wonderful way, has created a way that we can dialogue with ministries and other communities, that the advocacy community, so that we're all speaking in an evidence-based fashion, recognizing resource applications in this ordered way. I think that we went from the parent guideline to resource stratification, which I think was a really important application, particularly as we're thinking about healthcare systems and talking to ministries of health. But I think the harmonization really took it to another level. And because what it did was it asked for the people practicing in this environment, what could work here? What makes sense? What seems appropriate? And you can be aspirational, but you also can recognize what's realistic. And so I think that the Sub-Saharan African harmonized guidelines provide these volumes of information about what one can and should do in this environment. What I was most struck by, and I sense it from the discussion we've had today, when those guidelines were first presented in Paris at the UICC meeting, the colleagues that were presenting it were from Africa. The NCCN staff was sitting in the back of the room, which is exactly the way it should be. And they were talking about our NCCN guidelines. And that sense of this is a product that we've put together that is based upon what we know and do. This is exactly the way we need to be able to communicate with countries that are trying to adapt and learn. So that sense of ownership, I think, is something that you've been able to create that's really, really powerful. And I'm so excited. I think the last thing I would say is that when we first talked about resource stratification and breast cancer, we spent actually 3 global summits developing what we thought was this right framework and testing and looking at it. What was really interesting about the NCCN methodology, we took this, Dr. Carlson, you were at the meeting, and we said, okay, here's the idea. And we sat down with panelists. The chair of the breast panel sat down, looked it over, sort of went click, 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 click. And in about 2 minutes was able to reproduce what it took us 6 years to do. And what it speaks to is this methodology, I think, is really solid. So when you look at this 70 plus guidelines that are available, that the method works and should not be underappreciated for what it is. Because really what we're going to be needing to be doing in countries around the world is moving past the guidelines into application. And I think the train is leaving the station in that way, and NCCN is a major leader in that regard.
Thank you. So we've gotten a series of questions through the Q&A system that I think actually relate one to another. The first is when we look at you look at the NCCN guidelines and the U.S. FDA approved indication, there's often a bit of a disconnect or a large gap between FDA approvals and NCCN approvals. Related to that is a question about what kind of studies or evidence is really considered by the panels to get a specific therapy on the guideline. Then there's a related question about biosimilars and how can we be confident in using biosimilars within the oncology space, and how do you assess the quality of a biosimilar? What's the evidence that you use in that regard? So I don't know, Dr. Kumar, Dr. Brown, go for it.
Sure. I think the purpose, right? I think the FDA looks at evidence in a very different way. Is the drug safe for the patient? Is the drug effective? And often it's in the context of individual drugs. And in cancer, I think we have learned obviously over the years that we have to use a variety of different combinations in order to treat cancers, especially some of the incurable ones like myeloma, where we end up using multiple different combinations in different sequences. And I think what the NCCN really tells you, or the guidelines are really based on, obviously evidence that's phase 3 trials, but also the experience of 30-some people who treat these patients with cancers day in, day out, and what they have learned from their day-to-day experience and what the patients need. And I think that is where the NCCN guidelines really make a difference. FDA tells you what you can, and NCCN tells you what you need and what you should with the tools that are available. So I think the way the therapies are outlined in the guidelines clearly states what is the level of evidence, and we still take the randomized phase 3 trial-based evidence as the gold standard. We certainly go with that as our option one in majority of the cases. And then it also gives you the options. What else can you do for these patients if you cannot use exactly that? And clearly, these are based on lesser levels of evidence in terms of phase 2 trials. But collectively, the people who are on the panels who are making that decision and prioritization have worked with those regimens. And we feel comfortable that based on our own experience as well as published literature, that this is going to help the patient in front of you. So I think that's where it is a guidance for the community physicians, community oncologists who are treating these patients. But I think it's also a good guidance, as we already know, for the payers to say they feel comfortable that they are not paying for a drug which is unlikely to be effective for the patients. So I think that's where the perceived gap from between the FDA guidance and what the NCCN guidelines provide.
I agree 100%. And I would just add that, in pediatrics in particular, if we were limited to FDA labeled indications for cancer drugs, we'd be in a lot of trouble. The vast majority of what we do as standard practice in pediatrics is off-label from an FDA perspective. That's changing over time. As you know, tisagenlecleucel, which is the first FDA-approved CAR T-cell therapy, was approved first in pediatrics. And there are now incentives for FDA-labeled indications in pediatrics that didn't exist in the past. And that's having a big impact. But that nonetheless, it's still extremely important in pediatrics as it obviously is in adults as well. For a therapy to be in the NCCN guidelines, FDA approval of the product generally for some indication is a first step, but by no means is necessary. And that's because the amount of investment, the administrative steps necessary to get an FDA labeled indication are an additional step beyond what is necessary for us as clinicians to believe that something is best practice for patients. And that's true throughout cancer therapy. And so that's why there is a disconnect, and there has to be a disconnect, I think, in order to provide optimum care within the US system. In terms of biosimilars, there are FDA approved biosimilars, and those by NCCN policy automatically get incorporated into all of the NCCN guidelines including global adaptations. And then there are biosimilars that have not been considered by the FDA. And that's really where we have to rely on our regional colleagues to give us their experience. I don't feel personally that our guideline is in a position to has the expertise to really think about biosimilars that are available in one part of the world, but have not been considered by the FDA. And we really have to rely on the expertise and local knowledge of our regional partners. That's how I would address that.
Thank you. So a related question for Dr. Dungu is, not only is there sometimes an issue about what the drug name is, but there's an issue about whether the drug is actually the drug, whether it's a counterfeit medication or an inadequate medication. And I saw a statistic recently that it was estimated somewhere between 10 and 20% of oncology medications in sub-Saharan Africa were actually fraudulent medications. How do you deal with that, Dr. Dungu? How do you assure that within your supply chain, you're getting what you think you're getting?
Well, that's a really good question. And maybe to even help us understand better. I think in sub-Saharan Africa, we have confused generic drugs with biosimilar drugs, because I think we tend to get generics, the cheap generics, and probably less of the biosimilars. I wanted to make that clarification. It is very true that we get a lot of substandard medicines. We saw it like from my center, where you treat someone with a so-called medicine, but then the effects are not there until when you go ahead and assess for quality checks. You realize that actually this product crystallizes even when you follow guidelines on how to reconstitute it. This one changes color after a few minutes. How we have tried to go about this is by working directly with the manufacturers of these products. I'll give an example of, let me just speak from nowhere, Novartis. If we went and worked directly with a company like that, and we come to an understanding so that we buy directly from them rather than getting from different suppliers, we tend to ensure quality. And I think this is what the Clinton Foundation has also tried to help with, and the NCCN to come up with these collaborations where we can all come up and say we are going to procure medicines, and the manufacturer will give them to us at a reduced price, a price that is affordable. That is one of the strategies of trying to reduce on the counterfeits. Then the other way is, I wish there was no corruption in the world, because with corruption, even a counterfeit product might pass a quality check, because our regulatory offices, they now have in place quality assessment laboratories to make sure that each product that comes in meets the standards. But not every country in Sub-Saharan Africa has that. Just a few countries. Uganda is now lucky to have maybe one of those labs, but having them in place does not guarantee that you're going to actually have a product registered. And then the other issue that we've had that is making our quality not easy to assure is that most of our cancer medicines are actually not registered in the country. They are all imported on special permits. If a product is registered in the country, then we are assured of quality. But if you can bring in a product based on need, say, oh my God, we have a patient who needs trastuzumab, and we call on someone, oh, can you supply this? There we are not guaranteed of the quality of the product. I submit.
Thank you. So one of the concerns that I sometimes hear voiced about the international guidelines, especially the framework strategy, the resource stratified guidelines, are situations where a country may have a hospital as a public healthcare system, as well as a private healthcare system, and that the private healthcare system is in general better funded than the public. And if you put out a guideline, the government may go with the lowest level of care that they think that is reasonable, and the private payers may actually try to go down to that low level of payout, if you will. And yet, if you use the higher tier resource guideline, the public hospitals may not be able to provide that level of resources that are required. You know, what's the impact of having stratified guidelines and so on in a region on innovation, on access, on availability? Anyone have any input or thoughts about that?
I have a comment about it. You're identifying a very real challenge, and it is most certainly not limited to sub-Saharan Africa, but that this two-tiered system, that this is very common in Latin America and many parts of Asia, where there's a public system that is, as you said, has very limited capacity, and then there's a private system that is able to provide this high quality care. And it can be a way that, and so the people who can pay get pulled out into this private system. They may get the care that they need. It's not well managed or controlled. And the problem here is that the healthcare system isn't paying enough for the public system to really sustain full-time people. And I mean, you may have seen these examples of where the hospital looks really empty in the afternoon because everybody is off in their private practice, doing what they need to actually survive because the salaries are so poor. I don't know that there's a good solution to this problem, and ultimately this is at the national level that has to be addressed. But we have a manuscript in press that will be coming out next month in Lancet Oncology, and what it looked at was what are the common features of healthcare systems that have succeeded in getting that dropping breast cancer mortality that we've seen in high-income countries, that 40% drop in mortality. And there were two features that are associated with this, looking at the full range of countries where we could get data. One feature is the relative degree of universal health coverage, that, in other words, paying for it, which there's a standard index that's measured that gives you an idea how broad is that. And the other is number of public cancer centers per 10,000 cancer patients. Number of private centers didn't seem to help. The number of public ones did. This is, I think, going to be a very important message because it provides this impetus and evidence-based rationale for countries to say, we really do have to think about the public centers and what they are, which, you know, just number of centers is a surrogate measure. And we have to think about coverage, because we learn over and over again, including in the United States, when you don't pay for the care, you don't have a realistic way of paying for it, you cannot expect the overall population statistics to get better. One of the comments that was made about the manuscript by the reviewers was, well, what about the US? Because the US does not do particularly well in universal health coverage. And the point was made that that's true. So what the US does instead is we pay exorbitantly we pay 18% of our gross national product into healthcare, to the point that it's really not so you can overcome not having universal health coverage by paying a boatload of money. And so I think that this is something that governments will need to think through. You could have a system where you pay the private system to do these things, but one should be aware what the evidence suggests is that will end up being really expensive, as opposed to building the infrastructure that really needs to be present. Thanks.
Interesting. So, Dr. Brown, NCCN, when it was first organized and published its first guidelines back in 1995, there were a handful of actually pediatric guidelines, but they ultimately weren't updated because almost all the kids at that time were treated on national protocols. And so there was relatively little use for guidelines. You know, more recently, NCCN has gotten back into the pediatric oncology space, both at the request of US pediatric oncologists, but also especially on the basis of our international colleagues calling for pediatric guidelines to assist them in pediatric care. Could you talk about the NCCN initiative in terms of pediatric guidelines and your perspective on how valuable you think they are or are not, both in the US as well as internationally?
Absolutely. I think they're incredibly valuable in both settings. And, where NCCN has appropriately focused its priority in guideline development in pediatric space are in pediatric cancers with particularly excellent outcomes, where clinical trials, I'll just take the example of the guideline that I worked on, which is pediatric acute lymphoblastic leukemia. Overall survival for pediatric that includes adolescent and young adult acute lymphoblastic leukemia is now in excess of 90%. And so there are subsets within that approach 100% event-free survival. And so designing randomized clinical trials to improve on that outcome with event-free survival as a primary objective, as a primary measure, have become impossible. And care has been largely standardized in that setting, even in the US. And so while it used to be the case that the vast majority of children with cancer in the US were enrolled in clinical trials, that's no longer true. And so guidelines are extremely important in that setting to harmonize, to publish, to make available, to standardize that excellent care and those excellent outcomes. And that's where I think a lot of the impetus came from within the US for these guidelines. And so I think that's been an extremely important and valuable resource development. And then in terms of international, I think the impetus was even more clear, and the importance is even more is even greater because in many of these international settings, this standardization simply had not occurred, and I think it's particularly important and impactful. And I think the statistics in terms of downloads of the pediatric guidelines are backing that up. So I'm very proud of the effort. I think it's been a great thing for NCCN to take on, and I hope it will continue to raise its level of impact over time.
Dr. Dungu, your perspective on pediatric guidelines for use in sub-Saharan Africa. Did you take care of little people also?
Well, I don't take care of little people. I used to, but I stopped when we established a program for that. And actually, our first engagement was when we had a meeting in Ethiopia. And it really went on well. For a long time, we're using guidelines from SIOP, Africa, from different groups. But now we're trying to make sure that our colleagues in pediatrics are getting so much involved into these harmonized guidelines. And one thing I still can feel proud of by being part of this is when we had experts like Pat join us in these discussions. They're so educative, because when we are doing the harmonization, I'll tell you, we are not super experts for us in Sub-Saharan Africa, and we are working with experts from the NCCN. They help us to understand a number of things, and that we've been able to, with confidence, implement what we have agreed on. So, yeah, I would say that the pediatric guidelines hadn't been there, but now are there, and we hope more will be added so that, our colleagues in pediatrics can also have that.
If I can say so, I was incredibly impressed by the level of knowledge of the published literature among the regional experts. In many cases, that knowledge exceeded that of my own within my own field. And I was, pointed to publications that I had not been aware of. So to say it's a two-way street is not an exaggeration. It may have been educational for you and your colleagues, Dr. Dungu, but I can tell you that it was extremely educational for me as well.
Thank you.
Yeah, that certainly has been my personal experience in the travels that I've done in sub-Saharan Africa. That the challenges of oncology care is not a knowledge problem; it's a resource problem, and that's really a key point here. If we provide the resources, I'm confident that they will be used appropriately. We just need to get the resources there and then scale up the system. Yeah. Dr. Dengu, we've talked a lot about guideline development and so forth. One of the real challenges, of course, of guideline development and so on is the challenge of implementation. Talk to us about how you're implementing the guidelines, what your plans are ultimately in terms of that. You know, how are they used by the oncology community in sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, I cannot say to what degree we are implementing them, but of course, I, for one, I use the NCCN guideline 100%. I don't have any other guidelines that I can refer to. And we are trying to really sell out this to everyone. We have a fellowship training program, and it's one of the tools that we use, and we tell all the fellows to get used to this. Even during our, if we write a publication that is focusing on sub-Saharan Africa, we've been referencing the harmonized guidelines as a resource. It's something that we still have to sell out to everyone, because I don't think all the people practicing oncology in sub-Saharan Africa have access to the guidelines, or they are aware of these guidelines. So I think it's one way that we need to continue like spreading the gospel of the guidelines.
So Ben, you've done a lot of thinking recently, I know, on implementation. Do you have thoughts about how NCCN and the African Cancer Coalition and ACS and CHI should go about actually trying to stimulate implementation of the use of the guidelines in sub-Saharan Africa?
Well, yes, I have thoughts. Whether they're good thoughts or not, you'll have to decide. I think that this has much to do with audience, because as you said, the limitation that I have seen, I could not agree more, and with Dr. Brown's comment about when I visit countries, I'm going as a student, not as a teacher, because I learned so much. Things I saw as a surgeon in Africa about managing difficult wounds, for example, that I would see maybe once every month or two that were.
Oh no, we lost him. I assure you he was not censored.
Sorry, I'm back.
Great.
Could I finish my thought? My thought is, when you're talking to a ministry, the ministry is not thinking about breast cancer or childhood cancer. They're thinking about cancer in the context of non-diseases, in the context of healthcare. They've got a really big job. And so we need to frame things in ways that are speaking in ways that ministries can understand. And so where I see tremendous value in the NCCN frameworks is that not just at looking at one disease at a time, but looking at resources collectively that, well, how could I manage breast and cervical and lung? And what would I need to add in order to do GI? And we could really put this together in a package that would be useful to.
Hopefully he'll be back in a second.
So while waiting, Dr. Carlson, maybe if I can just bring up a point.
Of course.
Do you think it's, when we talk about implementation, and we previously talked about how the different framework might drive kind of the race to the bottom, hopefully not, but involving the government agencies as part of the implementation process might actually prevent that from happening and actually provide them with some guidance as to how, what is next that they need to do for cancer in terms of not just research, but also in terms of care. And has that been an approach in terms of, starting them, incorporating their input right from the point where we start implementing them?
So thank you for that question and comment. So really the beginning of this effort in sub-Saharan Africa was to a major degree the responsibility of Isaac Adewole, who was the Minister of Health for many years in Nigeria. And he recognized the need for guidelines in sub-Saharan Africa and was a strong advocate for the guidelines being regional, not just Nigerian, but regional, because there's so much sharing of patients across borders in sub-Saharan Africa because of the limited resources. And in part because of that, the African Cancer Coalition, which really represents the experts, the oncology experts in sub-Saharan Africa, and it includes their clinical oncologists, their surgeons, nurses, pharmacists, cancer center administrators, and importantly, representatives from the ministries of health. Now, not all the participating countries have their ministries of health represented, but several of them do. And that's been incredibly valuable, I think, because it helps to ground it in, what's the perspective of the ministries of health in this process. And to date, we've had 6 ministries of health in sub-Saharan Africa actually endorse the harmonized guidelines. And I think that really speaks to the perspective of the health ministries of health in that region. And those ministries of health, as Tracy pointed out, that have endorsed the guidelines represent 43% of the population in sub-Saharan Africa. So it's a very meaningful group of countries and ministries of health. But Henry, do you have, Dr. Dungu, do you have comments on this issue?
Well, I don't think I have a lot to add to this, but it's true that when you look at the regions, we have a lot in common, and we have a lot in common in terms of challenges. When we were beginning, I mentioned that, before we could meet, you would imagine that your colleague in Zimbabwe is having better resources, or you think your colleagues in Nairobi are doing better than this. But we realized that actually, as a region, we had a lot in common. And by putting ideas together, we agreed to, it's so challenging. When you look at the parent guidelines and they're trying to harmonize them, you look at the black, and then when you say, what do we do? Everyone says gray out. And you're like, hey, so you mean you also don't have this? One time we're talking about, low intensity CT scans as one of the assessments in myeloma. And none of us could do that. It's a regional challenge. It's a regional challenge that required regional experts with the support from others to come up with a solution. So I think I can leave it like that. And we've been trying to use this to make sure that it's an inspirational tool that we can use to help us get to black, move away from blue to black. And we hope it is going to continue like that.
Thank you. So Ben, welcome back. Did you have any thoughts you wanted to finish?
I think I covered it.
Great. So I'd like to move a little bit from sort of the technical to a little bit more of the personal, maybe even emotional. I know when Ben helped arrange a number of years ago, my first trip to sub-Saharan Africa to visit cancer centers and to do a situational analysis and so on, I found the experience truly life-changing. It gave me a totally different perspective on medicine when I came back to the United States. There are friendships that I developed during that 2-week time period that last to today. I'm just curious as to, from the 4 of yours perspective, how has this process impacted you professionally, personally, as opposed to sort of the technical aspects of medicine? And I won't call on who's going to go first, but anybody who chooses to can go first.
I'd like to comment on that. I've had that same fabulous experience that you're talking about, so eye-opening. In 2014, my younger son, Christopher, was diagnosed with Burkitt lymphoma. Actually, I diagnosed him. He had a mass in his axilla and was quite sick. And I got to watch him go through his care for Burkitt lymphoma. The irony that it was a surgeon in sub-Saharan Africa that originally described that's who Burkitt was quite powerful to me. But I was struck by the equity issue. My son, who's alive and well and living in Rochester, Minnesota, is doing so because of where he came from. And that there's a fundamental inequity in that's the reason I'm at WHO. I want to see what can I do in this incremental way to move this more towards something that is more fair than was that case. I also want to say that I learned during that experience how much we underappreciate what nurses do. Nursing is so essential, and not just for the support and all the things that we love about that, but the technical things the nurses do that we don't talk about and are not, if they're in the guide, exactly know where they are. But that quality control, you cannot do what we do without nursing. And I don't know where to do that in the NCCN context, but God bless nurses. Thank you.
Agree with that. Thanks, Ben.
So I would add, first of all, Ben, I'm so happy to hear that your son is doing well. And, the aggressive NHL is one of the pediatric guidelines that's been developed through NCCN. And I hope that this equity issue that you so rightly highlight will be addressed by that. Couldn't agree more about the importance of nursing in what we do in pediatric oncology and through cancer in general. What I will say is that I so underappreciated before my trip to Ethiopia to work on these harmonized guidelines, my own personal prejudices, and to be able to face them, address them, and manage them was such an important part of that. And I want to be transparent about that because, I certainly didn't consider myself to be a prejudiced person, but when you have that personal experience in a region where you've not been before, and just the example I gave about the level of knowledge, it was just so eye-opening to me, and it made me realize that some of my presumptions about different regions of the world were just completely wrong and misinformed. And it has helped me, and so that has helped me personally in so many ways in terms of addressing my own inherent biases and prejudices, and has helped me in so many other aspects of my life as a result of that. And so that's one thing I wanted to add to what Dr. Anderson said. It's been an incredibly rewarding process.
And I just want to add a couple of words to that. I mean, it was certainly an eye-opening experience for me. I mean, I rediscovered again, the disparities in healthcare after having been kind of insulated in the US healthcare system for almost 2.5 decades. It really brought forth, we talk about more individualized medicine and chimeric antigen receptor T cell therapy for heme malignancies. And on one day and the next day, we are talking about, can we actually, get a beta-2 microglobulin and LDH to risk stratify patients. And that was, I still walked away from that harmonization meetings over the 2 days with a totally, newly found respect for these conditions under which you still manage to deliver excellent healthcare to patients with that limited resources. And I think what I really took away from those meetings is the passion behind, again, individuals like Dr. Tungu who are part of that panel. The ultimate goal, make the patient better with whatever we have in hand.
Dr. Dungu?
Well, I don't know if there's a lot I can add because it's been brought out, the issue of equity and disparities in resources has made it so difficult for us to practice. Actually, I want to say this, that until recently, we didn't have so many people in the practice of oncology, whether surgical oncology, whether radiation oncology, whether medical oncology. And up to now, in Uganda, we have maybe less than 5 people who are practicing hematology. It's all has become like this because of lack of motivation, not in terms of pay, like money, but if you have a cancer patient, so what are you going to do for them? We don't have what it takes. You can't even access prednisone as part of CHOP combination chemotherapy. So it has been like that. If you want to practice radiation oncology and there's only one cobalt 60 machine in the entire country, which machine keeps breaking down. Many of you remember when we had a challenge in Uganda, our only cobalt machine got broken down and we had to, borrow ideas from Aga Khan in Nairobi to help us treat patients. So all these have been, the challenges that have made us not practice. And I don't know, recently people are getting motivated, people are getting, through advocacy and talking to our leaders, having, people like Dr. Anderson in WHO who are going to continue advocating, having colleagues in NCCN, when you give us, help us get into these guidelines and we tell our leaders that, what, if we follow this, we can practice good cancer care. It makes us get more motivated and probably continue to take care of our people.
Wonderful. Well, I'd like to thank our 4 panelists, Dr. Dungu, Dr. Kumar, Dr. Brown, Dr. Anderson, for sharing your expertise and your experiences with us.
Thank you again for joining us for the second module, Spreading Equitable and Accessible Cancer Care Through Multilateral Partnerships. Before I hand it over to Dr. Carlson to lead this second panel, I just wanted to let everyone know that we're very proud to announce that we have the 2022 Global Policy webinar series topics that I wanted to share with you. You'll be getting more information about this early next year, but I'm excited about them and wanted to share that we have 2 phenomenal topics that we're going to be covering next year. Impact of policy regulation on guideline concordant care globally, and the impact of policy and regulation on global inequities in pediatric cancer. So this is, again, global stakeholders, including patients, patient advocates, oncology providers, policymakers, and caregivers who come together to discuss these really important topics. We're very proud of our global policy webinars. It's an opportunity to, again, meet with peers and attend virtually. So you'll be able to get more information on that in the coming year, but I wanted to share that exciting announcement with you right now. So with that, I'm very excited about this next panel. Again, spreading equitable and accessible cancer care through multilateral partnerships is something we work very hard with here at NCCN. And with that, I will hand it over to Dr. Carlson to lead the panel.
Great, thank you very much, Tracy, and welcome back, everyone. And welcome to those of you who may have just joined us for this session. For this panel discussion, we have a group of experts on international oncology care to share their experience and provide best practices from the perspective of multiple stakeholder groups in order to spread equitable and accessible cancer care globally through multilateral partnerships. So I'd like to start by having the panel introduce themselves, and we'll do it in the order that we see on the slide. So Ms. Kobayashi.
Hi, thank you very much. It's an honor to be invited and to participate in this panel. So my name is Emily Kobayashi. I'm a public health practitioner with over 15 years experience supporting health systems in sub-Saharan Africa. I'm representing today the Clinton Health Access Initiative, which is a global health organization focused on saving lives and reducing the burden of disease in low and middle income countries. Our unique expertise relates to securing access to high quality health commodities And to date, we've done over 150 agreements covering a wide variety of different health commodities. Since 2017, we've partnered with the American Cancer Society and manufacturers of quality assured cancer medicines and the procurers of those medicines to try to increase the access to those medications in sub-Saharan Africa. So thank you for having me.
Great. Thank you for joining us. Dr. Marte.
Hi, thank you so much for the invitation to be on this panel. My name is Yehuda Marte. I am a medical oncologist at the University of Pennsylvania. I'm also the Vice Chief for Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion at the University of Pennsylvania. So prior to the pandemic, I spent about half of my time in Botswana, where I did mostly clinical and research work. And I was also the adjunct lecturer at the University of Botswana. My research focus really has been on mapping out the landscape of access to essential medicines for cancer treatment in sub-Saharan Africa and other low resource settings. And currently in Botswana, I'm working on looking at implementation strategies for optimizing breast cancer care delivery among breast cancer patients who are also diagnosed with HIV in Botswana. And so thank you so much. I'm excited to hear from other panelists and to be on here as well.
Great, welcome. Dr. Romero.
So thank you, Robert. And I'm really glad to be part of that panel actually today, because I have the impression that I'm the rookie among all of those stars. So thanks a lot. I'm Yannick Romero, molecular biology by training. I've done the last decade working in the private sector, working on oncology and genetics and HIV. And then I moved to the Union for International Cancer Control 4 years ago, leading the national cancer control planning efforts, working with different countries to help them and support them into the evaluation, the analysis of their cancer control plans. I'm also sitting on the steering committee of the International Cancer Control Partnership and leading the technical assistance group of that partnership. So really glad to be part of that panel. Thanks a lot.
And Dr. Gopal.
Thanks so much. I'm Satish Gopal. Thanks for the invitation. I presume I was included because I work at the National Cancer Institute. Many of you will be familiar that the NCI is the US government agency that is tasked with supporting and conducting cancer research. It's the largest funder of cancer research in the world. The NCI has actually been engaged globally since the Institute's founding in 1937. And 10 years ago, it was felt that there was enough need and opportunity that there was a need for a dedicated Center for Global Health, which was established by Harold Varmus, who was the NCI director at the time and actually now chairs the WHO Science Council. So I was recruited last year to direct the Center for Global Health at the NCI, and I've been at the NCI for the last year and a half. And so I'm pleased to join the panel. Perhaps relatedly, before coming to the NCI, I was an NCI-supported extramural physician scientist, but my academic life was all spent living and working in sub-Saharan Africa, where I took care of patients in the public sector, oversaw a clinical research program that really tried to address questions of relevance to the local environment, and then mentored a lot of young US and African investigators who are interested in developing cancer research careers. So that experience may be relevant for this conversation as well. Thanks very much.
Wonderful. So our challenge this morning is to talk about equitable and accessible care. The term equitable has a lot of different meanings and so forth. And I'd like to hear from each of you, your perspective on, within the context we're talking today about international global health issues, what does equitable mean to you? And let's start with Ms. Kobayashi.
So I think access to equitable care is sort of the foundation of what we do as CHAI. And in terms of definition, just thinking about the fact that every person, regardless of their place of birth or their specific financial circumstances, deserves access to care that allows them to fulfill their potential, and that the systems that deliver that type of accessible care are what is key to lifting people out of poverty and leading to those types of generational changes. And for our organization, where we see that change coming from is from engagement with government and change driven by government. I think Dr. Anderson's forthcoming research kind of points to this, the fact that in many of these countries, only government has the scale to promote greater availability of care and actually reach everybody that's there. So that's core to our approach, is working with governments to create and sustain those high quality health systems that can deliver equity.
And Dr. Marte, what does equitable and accessible mean to you?
Yeah, I think sort of similar to what Emily has said. I think when I think about equitable care, I think fundamentally it's realizing that different communities and societies have diverse needs. And so equitable care, therefore, means addressing these underlying disparities by formulating policies and implementing, and I agree, like it has to be implementing systemic solutions to address these underlying inequities in order to achieve the same quality of care. And this is regardless of geographical location, race, ethnicity, gender, socioeconomic status. I think the systems, I agree that the systems approach is most effective. And so really we can't address equitable care by, using the individual approach. And so looking at local governments, international health organization, private entities, and multilateral organizations, I think are fundamental to achieving equitable care globally, especially when we think about the cancer sphere. I think it is absolutely critical to think about what the underlying systems are that create these inequities and then addressing them. So realizing that it's the same approach is not going to be one size fits all, but realizing that some systems and some communities are going to need different and specific and sometimes more help or more resources, I should say, than others, and being able to understand those in detail and address that is what really is the underpinning of providing equitable care.
And Dr. Romero, what does equitable mean to you in this context?
Well, I will second Yoda and Emily actually on their definition of equitable care. The thing is that we have to keep in mind that we want to reduce the health disparities among all the different communities. We were talking about gender and ethnicity, but also according to the age. And I think that also something that we have to keep in mind for cancer care about the elderly and the fact that cancer, it's a late onset disease. So we have to keep that in mind. And also that when we talk about equitable care and specifically most of the time of access or equitable cancer care, we address the treatment mainly, and this is what we have in mind. And I think that we have to also think about the whole continuum of cancer care, which goes from risk reduction, prevention. I heard about Ben mentioning about the screening. So access to all this care along the cancer control continuum, it's key to have access to equitable care. Thank you.
And Dr. Gopal.
Thanks. Maybe just to add something a little different, I think from the point of view of a research agency, we think about equity in research. And so, and I think we believe that means that populations around the world should have the opportunity to meaningfully participate in cancer research and benefit from cancer research. I think we acknowledge very clearly that hasn't been the case throughout the history of cancer research. I think the example that Ben gave related to Burkitt lymphoma is a very, telling one that I often use, as I'm giving talks. I think for care, I think here there's probably some obligation to balance idealism and pragmatism. And so to me, equity in care means that there's some minimum standard below which we don't allow patients to fall. And I think the guidelines and harmonized stratified guidelines can be a very important tool for achieving that. And perhaps we can have more conversation about how to do that as we proceed.
So now that we have a sense, and I think there's actually pretty remarkable consistency across the four of you in terms of what equitable means, let's talk about what some of the barriers to achieving that equitable care might look like or do look like. Ms. Kobayashi, want to take a stab at that?
Sure. I mean, I think, so our program, as I mentioned, has really focused on access to medications as one of the key building blocks of cancer treatment. And when we look at all of the challenges we face in terms of access to medications. And there are a lot, you know, regulatory, business, patients access, but a lot of what it comes down to is actually just sort of the dearth of resources in the system. When we look at, especially in Africa, the health systems that are delivering cancer diagnosis and care. And so without enough resources to go around, the first thing you see is very much restrictions on individuals' access to care. So you have people at the very tip of the income pyramid who are able to actually travel abroad and access world-class standards of care. And anyone who can afford to do that, that's usually their first step. And then just below them, we have a group of people that may be able to get access to high quality care in the private sector in their own country, or travel to an adjacent country and get access through even importing specific drugs for that patient and working with the oncologists around them. And then pretty much the rest of the pyramid, you'll have mostly people who are not able to really access what we would consider a decent standard of cancer care, and will usually end their cancer treatment journey before it would be clinically indicated, because cost is preventing them from pursuing treatment further. And sometimes that happens before they even get a full diagnosis and workup and treatment plan. Sometimes they're able to purchase a few rounds of treatment and then they fall out of care. And the impact of the cost on them and their families, and when we talk about families, we're talking about sometimes 2 or 3 generations of wealth that are wiped out just by the costs. So I think that's the sort of the first place where the lack of sufficient resources and financial protection for patients shows up. But it also shows up in terms of what the system is actually able to deliver. What are the lab resources? What are the imaging resources? What are the surgical resources, clinical, and everything you can imagine in a health system that would be required to treat people? Because there's this lack of investment overall, the services that you would want to see available aren't there either. And then as a corollary of that, what we find is that high quality companies whose products are needed, be they medications, devices, or other, aren't able to engage with those systems in a way that's productive. So that even if they wanted to improve access to their products in that context, the patients that are there are not being diagnosed. And even if they are diagnosed, there's no way for them to afford those high quality products that they would need that could lead to positive clinical outcomes. So I think it's important for us to not just say, well, there's no money, but the fact that the lack of money drives both those inequities that we talked about at the beginning, but also the systemic weaknesses that prevent patients from accessing care.
Thank you. Dr. Marte.
Yeah, I'd like to add, sort of coming from the perspective of a provider who's actually delivered care to patients in Sub-Saharan Africa. So I work primarily in Botswana. I think when I think about, these barriers, they exist sort of at the health system level, they exist along the continuum of care. So right from prevention to survivorship. As a medical oncologist, I tend to focus a lot more on sort of the treatment aspect. And so that isn't to say there aren't barriers all across like the cancer care continuum. But when I think about barriers to treatment, I think some of the barriers that we've seen are like lack of access to timely and complete diagnostic information to inform clinical decisions. And so we have patients waiting, a month, 3 months for breast cancer path results to result. We've had, incomplete molecular diagnosis made on breast cancer patients to inform treatment decisions. And so some of these actually are barriers to high quality care delivery when you don't have the complete diagnostics in a timely fashion. I think lack of access to affordable cancer medicines is also a huge barrier. We've noticed a lot of stockouts, which are not unique to Botswana, but not having drugs available consistently is a huge barrier to quality care delivery, even in countries where there's universal health coverage and the government is covering or paying for these cancer medicines. I think in terms of cancer care delivery, one of the barriers that we've noticed is access to high quality data. And so it's not just sufficient to treat patients, but it's the high quality data to measure impacts of cancer care delivery, and then also to inform policy-making decisions about how cancer care is delivered. And I think the lack of this data, real world data has been a huge impediment to actually developing interventions that are targeted to improve quality care delivery within the Sub-Saharan African context, I think.
So we see those barriers. What kind of collaborations can we have between different types of groups, governmental, NGOs, academic, and so on, in terms of trying to address those barriers? What are the right groups? What's the right configuration to try to begin to address this issue? Dr. Gopal?
I mean, I think on some level, all groups are required, right? I mean, it's that is the general approach that we have taken in the US, for example, is that progress against cancer has required oncologists and surgeons and nurses and patients and industry and advocates. And so, I think that putting together that kind of a multi-headed coalition it's not a trivial undertaking, but I think ultimately it's going to be necessary. And, again, I think the example of NCCN working with CHI, working with ACS, working with IBM is one, example of that. Dr. Romero talked about the International Cancer Control Partnership, which I think is another good example of that. But, I think when you are able to, and this was alluded to, I think, in the earlier panel, the first half, where, if you have diverse groups, you're going to get better ideas and solutions. And I think we have long understood that cancer care, even at the kind of clinical care delivery level, requires different and complementary capabilities, right? This idea of multidisciplinary tumor boards, that whole concept was founded in oncology. And I think we need to broaden that and include, as NCCN is doing, groups around the world, from various geographic backgrounds and also disciplinary backgrounds, in order to, I think, really develop the robust solutions that are going to make the kind of big change that's needed.
So Dr. Romero, the UICC is an organization of organizations. So how do you go about getting them to collaborate together on programs and efforts like this?
Well, I think that, everyone should be involved, actually, and related to your question about the collaboration and how we address those barriers. The first barriers, clearly it's about the communication and the governments and the framework. But just to jump on what Satish was telling, is that everyone should be involved, from the policymakers, and we've heard that from the first half, the healthcare workers, the importance of the nurses, industrial CSOs, the patients too, and every stakeholder should bring its voice and their perspective. The issue is too extensive, actually, to be addressed by only one sector, and this is why all the different parties should bring their experience to maximize the efforts, actually, to a common goal and a common objective. So in order to avoid the duplication, actually, of the efforts, we've seen that within the ICCP, the work that we've done, you can sometimes duplicate the work that is doing by other partners or other UN agencies. So you want to avoid that. That's also one of the barriers, and this is why you want to bring the diverse groups within those partnerships toward a common objectives, really sharing knowledge and mobilizing resources and develop connections. I think it's really key to develop those connections, because we all know each other in the cancer control area. So I think it's really that, and it is crucial to share the best practices, and this is what you do with the NCCN guidelines. A gold standard I have heard about, substandard, but I think that uniformity of the guidelines is really key to bring to that through those multi-sectoral partnerships. Thanks.
Thank you. So COVID-19 has really impacted all of us in uniformly negative ways. And I can't help but think that the pandemic has impacted issues of equitable access to care, especially in Africa. So can you talk a little bit about your observations in terms of equity and the impact of COVID-19 in Africa specifically. Dr. Marte?
Yeah, I should say that I think the impact of COVID hasn't been fully realized, and it's probably going to get much worse. But I think what the pandemic has done, as it has done in the US, is really shown a light on existing disparities. And so I think it's just really widened what was already there. And so when we think about the pandemic in Africa, I think it's just exposed fragile healthcare systems that are currently now overwhelmed and can't deal with a COVID-19 pandemic and deal with other non-communicable diseases and other disease epidemics going on in the region as well. I would say that, especially for cancer care, and I think it was mentioned in the prior session, a lot of our care in cancer is delivered through a centralized process. And so as we ramped up efforts to control the pandemic and had all these amazing mitigation strategies, I think cancer care and other diseases suffered a lot because it impaired people's ability to travel. And so in a place like Botswana, where it's just a population of 2 million, but it's a huge landmass, care was severely impacted. And I think Dr. Ndugu mentioned, and so people needed a pass to travel. And it's not a matter of, just getting a pass on your phone. You had to show up at either a district health facility or at a hospital, but you needed an authorization to show up. And so just the processes of going through this to get a pass to then travel, and then being in a place where transportation was also affected. And so a lot of our patients, especially those in rural areas, take public transport to the appointments. And so the pandemic also impacted your ability to travel through these means. And so by that, I just mean to say that the pandemic has really sort of amplified sort of the weaknesses in the system that already existed. And so in cancer care, we think about the poor and rural communities being the most vulnerable in Africa. I mean, as it stands, sub-Saharan Africa is disproportionately affected when you think about cancer care mortality. But then even within that context, patients who are outside of the city centers, who are furthest away from cancer centers, are even more affected by cancer. And so when you think about the impact of the pandemic on their livelihoods, I mean, not a lot of people can work remotely. Actually, most people cannot work remotely. And then think about accessing care in a place where you're very disconnected from the center of the city or from centralized cancer care delivery, I think has really impacted cancer care. And I think we haven't yet realized how much, or to the degree, the magnitude of the impact of the pandemic on cancer outcomes. But I think, as the data emerges, it's going to have a huge impact. And when I think about, the pandemic, I think everyone is thinking about how do we get to normal, or how do we get to a new normal, and vaccination is how we do that. But then again, you see disparities being highlighted again. And so most of sub-Saharan Africa have vaccinated, less than 1% or 2% of their population. And so, the question is, how do we overcome this pandemic and sort of rebuild the systems? And I think the pandemic is going to live on for longer in sub-Saharan Africa. But I think what is also reassuring is that a lot of people are starting to realize that, it doesn't, like, individual countries cannot deal with the pandemic. And so there's really a need for multilateral organizations to play a central role in making sure that there's a global effort and creating equitable access to vaccinations, so that sort of collectively on a global level, we can achieve some sort of new normal post-pandemic. Sub-Saharan Africa has gone through different phases of the pandemic. Southern Africa and Botswana, where I work currently, is going through its surge with a peak that was in July. And it's unclear, sort of, with the low vaccination rates, whether they're going to be future surges. I think so. And so I think in a way, the pandemic has highlighted disparities that already existed. I think it's probably going to get worse. But I think there's a way we get around this with vaccination. And it's encouraging to see the new pledge from the Biden administration with 500 million more doses. I think at least the argument, I would say that I think it's been reassuring that people haven't said, well, once we get the vaccines to Africa, how are they going to distribute it? Because I've seen very different case scenarios where countries have been efficient in distributing vaccines in sub-Saharan Africa. I think the pandemic has also spurred innovation. And so we did a survey which showed that, in countries like Rwanda and then also in Ghana, drones are being used to deliver. I mean, this is not, widely used, but just to show that, I think people would think about innovative ways to deliver vaccine. And so I don't think the distribution of the vaccine is the problem in this case. And I think equitable access is really going to be relying on multilateral organizations and industry to make sure that the vaccines are actually available in sub-Saharan Africa.
Yeah, I couldn't agree with you more. But the virus doesn't carry a passport. It doesn't care what country it's in. So you're right. It's going to take more than a by country response to really get adequate control. Dr. Gopal, anything to add?
No, I mean, I'll just echo. I mean, obviously it's diverted scarce resources. It's disrupted services. And I think we are starting to have good data from the US and UK about, kind of the deficit in screenings that we need to try to make up. I think that data, as Dr. Marte says, is not as readily available in many low and middle income countries. So even for modelers to kind of try to assess what the likely effects are going to be on cancer morbidity and mortality, the model inputs, I think, are often not there. It's clearly highlighted in equity. We're even over the last week, we've been debating kind of how many boosters we might deserve in the United States and for whom, while frontline healthcare workers are not vaccinated in many low and middle income countries. And then I think it's offered models to achieve greater equity as well. And I think that's really kind of up to us to decide how fully we're going to embrace those models going forward. I think, walking into like a American football stadium, I'll say for an international audience, since football means something else to many of you, and, being able to get a vaccine at any time of day, wherever I want, without anybody asking me about my insurance first, that's not an experience that I have had in my lifetime, as an American citizen, although I've spent much of my adult life living abroad. And so you can think about what would happen if we harness that kind of machinery for HPV vaccination and really did that at a global scale. I think telehealth is another clearly very powerful tool that could be harnessed probably in important ways. So, I think that's remains to be seen. I think the willingness to really explore the potential of some of these tools to achieve real equity versus, as may already be happening, at least in the United States, kind of a default return to the way we're used to doing things. And, I think that just requires us to maintain a commitment on real equity rather than kind of stated equity.
So I'd be interested in your perspective on how cancer care guidelines, obviously very important to NCCN and organizations like NCCN, and I would add UICC. What role do those guidelines and organizations really take in promoting access to equitable cancer care? And what role should they take? Dr. Romero?
Yeah, I think that, this knowledge is really crucial and the best practices and has to be really delivered to the patient, actually to the cancer patient. Those guidelines really bring the uniformity to the countries and will help to really have an equity, reduce the disparities between patients and between the people within a country, actually. They should help to push to access those guidelines. We've done an exercise a few years ago about the analysis of all the national cancer control plans that were available. More than 158 countries were monitored. We used a huge questionnaire to know about different aspects of the cancer control continuum. And a few questions were about the guidance and the guidelines that were used actually to develop their plan. I'm not talking about the implementation, but developing the plans and the awareness of the guidelines from all the cancer control planners. And those numbers were really low, actually. We were talking about HPV vaccination, about really about prevention, screening, not specifically on treatment. But what I mean is that knowledge is not known by most of the countries in the world. And I'm not talking only on low and middle income countries. I'm not talking about countries that that are just struggling with their healthcare system. I'm talking about most of the countries do not have, are not really aware of the different guidelines. And I think that guidelines from the NCCN should play that role of bringing that knowledge, making awareness of the gold standards that has to be followed to really improve the cancer care in any countries, specifically in low and middle income countries. But it's something that there's a place and there's a role to play, and it could be a driver to access to equitable care, actually.
Ms. Kobayashi, do you have anything to add to that?
Yeah, I mean, I think the prior panel and I think Yannick's points really point to how the guidelines could set the standard for individual patient treatment, but I think they're also very important for health systems planners. So, you know, in the case of medication access, how many drugs do you need of what types, you know, for which facilities? Being able to do an accurate forecast if you don't have standard ways of treating certain types of patient is very difficult. And especially in these systems where we haven't been ensuring full supply of medications over time, it's very hard to say what you would actually need if the resources were made available. And then to take those evidence-based forecasts to policymakers and say, we need more budget so we can keep the drugs on the shelf for the patients that we're expecting. That's just on the drug side. I mean, I think it's also true for health insurance planners, health workforce planning, figuring out how to decentralize your care where your care is going to be required. So, so I think that the guidelines actually provide a really important foundation for that kind of those moves towards universal health coverage and access that do help to ensure equity, in addition to setting the standard for clinical care.
So we have a question in the chat box, or the Q&A box, that relates to this to some extent, and it points out that different organizations have different degrees of collaboration with others, and especially for those organizations that hesitate to collaborate, they often produce redundancies in effort, and in parallel efforts that are less effective because of that diffuse force, if you will. So, you know, how do we convince organizations like those that we all represent to work together, and how do we hold them accountable for really maximizing their efforts and degree of collaboration? And anybody that's brave enough to approach that can take that question.
I think I can try. I'm not sure that I have the good answer, but clearly, yeah, it's really tough to work. As an example, the ICCP is a 25 organizations partnership with different agenda. There is a common goal, there is a common objective, and I think it's really key to gather all those different people around the table and discuss what is the main ambition, what is the main mission and vision of a partnership, and how we can better collaborate together, establishing a clear framework with the coalition of the consortium, and yeah, asking for transparency and honesty between the organization, taking into account every stakeholder's agenda. You can have, and in each partnership, in each collaboration, there is always drivers, organization in the driver's seat and others that are following, but at least they can bring that expertise, that knowledge, and that's the difficulty. Yeah, we've done that. That partnership was born 10 years ago. Now in 2022, we will celebrate the 10 years of the ICCP. It came from an idea that there were gaps to fill in cancer control planning, and it's not itself an entity, it's really a partnership. And I think it took time, and the success is here. NCI is part of it, NCCN also, we have ACS, we have aortic, and so on. And it's really about communication, a clear framework, and governance, a clear governance. And I'm talking about the partnership, the ICCP partnership, but our work with the countries to discuss the NCCP is the same. We have the same type of structure for developing an NCCP, they need a multi-sectoral approach, bringing the Ministry of Education for training the health workforce, bringing the Ministry of Health, obviously, the Ministry of Finance to cost actually your plan. So it's really all those levels that we are working with, but it's a really difficult question to bring the organization that are not willing to work with you. But there are so many ways using, awareness, lobbying for your objectives. So many things to do together, and to show the investment is worthwhile actually. So that was my thoughts. Thanks a lot.
Anyone else have anything to add? Go ahead.
Yeah, I mean, if I could add, so I mean, the first thing is there's plenty of work to do. So there's no reason that we should be stepping on each other's toes or elbowing for turf. And that's not to say that if one organization is already focused in one area, that there's not room to expand their impact. So it's not to say there's only one research organization or one medicines access organization, not at all. So I think that's an important starting point. To the point of the national cancer control plans, those are instruments by which governments lay out their priorities of this is how we want to this is how we want cancer control to look in our country. So any partner that's not starting there, that's not starting with government and the existing oncology infrastructure is the ones that are at risk of doing work that is not contributing to this vast array of different things that actually do need support for. So I think for me, it's not really about how do we coordinate ourselves at the global level, though we should be coordinated, but really it's where the rubber hits the road is where the patients are, and the patients are in the care of existing institutions and existing governments. And so those are the ones that should be setting the lead and should be placed at the center. And I think our partnership with you and American Cancer Society is the key to that partnership is that we're working with the oncologists in the countries that we're trying to serve. So starting with them rather than starting at the global level, to me, I think is the most critical aspect for being well coordinated.
Interesting. So we're seeing a huge acceleration, I think, in technology and innovation in cancer care. We have multi-gene panels, we have new immune therapies, we have a number of targeted therapies, both for common as well as for sort of niche or small rare tumors, and so forth. But those are all expensive. They tend to be a relatively limited resource. So, is the innovation that we're seeing happening today making disparities better, making disparities worse? How do we go about managing these sort of high-end imaging techniques and so forth that we just can't make available to everyone, but can be very effective for some? How do we deal with that from a position of equity and access? Dr. Gopal, you come from the center of cancer innovation.
Yeah, I think this is a really good question. I think there's a lot more attention that has been paid to this recently. I will highlight at the upcoming Union for International Cancer Control meeting at the World Cancer Leadership Summit, we're actually having a dedicated panel on this very topic. I'll kind of go back to my COVID answer. I tend to think of technology sort of like COVID. I think it's morally inert. It doesn't have values necessarily. I think we ascribe values to it, as humans in the kind of design and application. And I think we often don't pay attention to that part and then ascribe the kind of disparity to the technology itself. There are a lot of good examples of this. For example, many of the machine learning algorithms for risk prediction that have been derived from specific populations and don't perform the same way, or actually perform quite poorly in populations that they've not been specifically derived and validated from. I think actually the best example of this is probably social media algorithms, right? I have 2 daughters who are relatively new Instagram users. I recently initiated a new official NCI Twitter account. And I think, there's been a lot of reporting even over the last week about the kind of ways in which we think of those algorithms as somewhat inert, but they're clearly designed and achieve certain outcomes and could be redesigned in different ways that would achieve perhaps more equitable outcomes. So, and I would say this is something that we're thinking about quite a lot. I mean, we have an Affordable Cancer Technologies program that we lead at the NCI Center for Global Health that's been fairly long-standing. We think that that's been a really important program that has contributed some really novel technologies to global cancer control. One example is it's helped accelerate the development of thermal ablation devices for treatment of cervical precancer. So historically, these have been treated with liquid nitrogen cryotherapy, which is just not a workable solution in rural clinics in sub-Saharan Africa. And so these new handheld battery-powered portable devices that can provide treatment at the point of need, we think is a real positive development. And those were very rapidly taken up by the WHO when investigators, NCI grantees, provided data through work that they were conducting with LMIC collaborators supported by the NCI to the WHO. That was such a glaring need that it was very rapidly taken up by guidelines. I mean, we've recently reissued that technology program. We've thought a lot about how that needs to kind of evolve and be redesigned to ensure that it remains responsive to the kind of end users and that they're involved from very early stages of technology development. So I think you raised a lot of important issues. I think it's the humans that are creating the disparity often and not necessarily the technology.
That's an excellent point. Thank you both. We've talked about collaboration and focusing on equity and access and so forth. Do any of you have concrete examples that you can discuss about how organizations collaborated and came forward with initiatives that really should improve equity and/or access?
I'd be happy to share an example from our collaboration with the government of Nigeria. In Nigeria, they don't have centralized purchasing of medicines. And so each individual hospital in the country goes out and buys their own. And they were really having trouble keeping medicines on the shelf. And what they found was that patients would get the prescription at the hospital, and then they'd go into the private sector to buy what they had on the list. Sometimes they'd really overpay. Sometimes they would get products that was not high quality or had not been secured in a quality cold chain. So basically what we did is we worked with government to establish a consistent supply of medicines for purchase in the hospitals. So the way we did it is we had pricing agreements we now have 4 companies that are participating, all of them providing quality assured medications only. The government created a regulatory pathway for those quality assured medications to come into the country without having to go through a years-long registration process. We got a number of hospitals together to forecast together for the first time what their needs would be. And then we engaged in country a private distributor and a private technology provider that would enable products to be continuously resupplied to the sites, payments to be captured by the patient, to be captured from the patients and remitted to all of those actors in the supply chain. And so what this has done is it has created at least one spot where patients know that they're going to get a quality assured medicine. We've cut out a number of the middlemen, so the prices are competitive with the quality medicines that would be available outside the hospital. And everybody's incentive is for the drugs to be on the shelf, because when the patient comes and pays is when everybody else gets paid. So it's one example where we were able to line up both those companies that had quality products and were interested in improving access in Nigeria, the planners at the Ministry of Health who controlled some of the barriers related to regulation and importation, the leadership of the hospitals who were grappling with these issues of patients coming with medications that were no good and spending their money on those types of things, and even the private sector locally that was able to provide those specific services. So I think that's one example of how we worked within a specific context with a number of different actors together to improve access for patients.
Thank you. Are you expanding that effort beyond Nigeria?
Well, I think what's been interesting is we've talked about it in other countries, and there are other national health systems that are interested in it, but it doesn't make sense for everyone. Some governments are already purchasing their medicines centrally, forecasting their medicines centrally, so it doesn't solve the problems that they have. And in each case, you need to understand what is the specific market inside this country. Unfortunately, each of these, every country is unique, the players are different, and the dynamics are different. So it's not necessarily a one-size-fits-all solution. But I will say we are working with 2 other governments in the region to see if there's some parts of this that would be of interest to them, if some of the principles would make sense, and working with them on crafting something specific.
So another question to follow up on that. So you commented on 4 companies. Are those 4 distributors, or are they 4 individual pharmaceutical manufacturers?
So these are the manufacturers. So we work with Novartis, Pfizer, Pediatrics, and Biocon Biologics right now. Each of these companies has entered an agreement with CHAI, and that sets the ceiling price on their products, and puts other requirements on them, including that any product supplied in Africa, for example, would also meet the quality standards of a stringent regulatory authority. So basically, they're motivated by wanting to improve access to their products in a sustainable way. So they're still going to be selling the products at a sustainable price, but the CHAI part of the partnership is to work with those procurers to make the volumes bigger, and to make the business economics of it work out, in the hopes that eventually we would reset the market a little bit. We would reset the market in such a way that it could sustain itself without any need for an agreement or for our role in the process.
Well, that's a win all around. So we have on the Zoom, I know, representatives from a number of global pharmaceutical companies. If any of them are not participating now and they wanted to consider participating, who would they contact?
Perhaps we could put the link to our website that has a contact form as a way to connect. So that's our Allied Against Cancer partnership. So I can put that in the chat.
Okay, that'd be great. And there's no charge for that free advertisement. Any examples from the UICC, Dr. Romero?
Well, that's kind of a different example. It's really about the implementation of a national cancer control plan and the priorities that were set in Eswatini actually a few years ago, where we helped them to get in touch with different stakeholders, either within the ministry or our members on site, to really focus on HPV and HPV screening and HPV vaccination also. They got in touch with a telecommunication organization company locally to really improve the network within the area, and then get in touch with women and young girls to improve the HPV vaccination rate and also the cervical cancer screening. So that's something that we witnessed and monitor, because the organization was really alone with that really nice project, but without any stakeholders and different parties. So they had to also build that multi-sectoral partnership with companies, ministry, local communities, religious communities also, because you have to go door by door and knock on the doors and ask to the women just to engage and enroll them into those activities, and using also the other women to engage all the communities. So that's really I would call a multi-sectoral and also a multi-sectoral partnership, engaging everyone from the ministry, from the local community and the different sectors, without forgetting about the patients, the civil society organization on the ground, the healthcare workers and community workers were really crucial and essential in their work on raising awareness on the issue of cervical cancer HPV vaccination, and also to raise awareness about that problem, but also to engage and make them commit to that objective. So it went well, and now that aspect was included in the priority of the NCCP, and they're working now at the national level just to implement that. So it's a bottom-up process that went from scaling down and pilot to scale up. And I think that's one of the issue of partnerships. Is there is a lot of pilots, there's a lot of pilot projects, but the issue is to scale up. And then according to the context, and I think that's Ben and Dr. Brown who mentioned it, resource stratification. And here we have a good example of about resource stratification and use of the situation and the resources in that context. Thank you.
So it's interesting. You've brought up the issue. We've heard some examples of country-specific interventions, like drug purchasing, cancer control plans that are country-specific, and so forth, and also some more global issues such as HPV vaccination for cervical cancer prevention and the COVID-19 vaccinations. So, what are the strengths and weaknesses of each approach, and how do we decide when you see an effort whether it should be focused on the country or focused on a region or a global effort like HPV vaccination? Dr. Martai, do you want to try to take that one?
Yeah, I think. I think as you rightly pointed out, there's really a diversity in terms of the problems that we're addressing. And I think the definition of the problem really determines which approach is best. I think just in general, I think international programs, so sort of huge multilateral international programs are necessary. But I think when it comes to thinking about how it impacts patient, it's not sufficient. And so this is where the country piece, I think, ends up being a more important element. And I think the NCCN harmonized guidelines has done this really well, but it's just really thinking about the successful implementation and adaptation of these international programs into the local context. And I think that is where we really see the impact of these programs when it's successfully adapted. And I think international programs are critical. And I think was mentioned in the previous session, they pull together like various expertise from different countries. And I think the main weakness, I'd say, of some of these international programs is that sometimes they're designed and targeted for a population that is not represented on the leadership or the boards of these like decision-making teams. And so that ends up being a weakness of these organizations because they're prescribing programs for populations where there isn't really a nuanced understanding of the population, the social structure, economic structure, cultural structure, and language. And so I think the synergy between international programs and country programs are really critical for successful implementation. I think there've also been scenarios where we've had like ingrown country programs that have been scaled up and externalized to other countries that have adopted it really well. But I think international programs are really important for setting the standards, like general standards and metrics for measuring outcomes across different settings. It also helps with making sure that these initiatives are scalable and can be replicated successfully in other countries so that each country isn't sitting down and reinventing the wheel, but really thinking about successful adaptation and using a common language when we measure success.
I couldn't agree more. I think the only thing I would add is galvanizing resources towards those common technical approaches and objectives. I think we've seen that, especially in the case of cervical cancer, where it came from the head of the WHO that cervical cancer elimination was going to be a priority, and that brought in new donors, new resources, and the new approaches. More simplified, accelerating access to thermal ablation, and lots of innovation that's happening with screening for precancerous lesions. So just galvanizing resources from the international level, but also having always the picture of how this is actually going to reach patients at the end of the day is the most important piece.
Any other comments on that issue from anyone? So the question I think I'd like to start with Dr. Gopal. Gopal's input on, given the NCI's strength and involvement in supporting clinical trial efforts, both in the US and globally. So, how can clinical trials play a role in equity and access to care, and what kind of partnerships are necessary in order to do meaningful clinical trials in sub-Saharan Africa, for instance?
Yeah, I mean, this is a really important topic that I would say we're thinking about a great deal. As you said, clinical trials have really been central, I think, to progress, to NCI-supported progress related to cancer. I think Dr. Brown alluded to this in the first session, that the strength of the guidelines is, I would say, in part the process, and in part the evidence base from which it draws, right? And so I would say that actually that will continue to be an issue that we should think about how we address for these regionally stratified guidelines, is that I think it, on some level, there also needs to be an evidence base generated beyond expert opinion in low and middle income countries that can inform guidelines that are intended for application in those environments. We believe that strongly and are kind of thinking about how we might try to support that. I think there's a lot of discussion at the NCI more broadly. I think COVID has spurred some of this about how to make clinical trials more inclusive. There's a clinical trials advisory committee that's a group of external advisors to the NCI that have recently put forward some recommendations that the NCI is thinking about implementing. I think many of those are focused on simplifying trial designs, making trial participation more inclusive. I mean, again, these were all things that we learned during COVID. I mean, the ability to kind of stand up these trials with tens of thousands of participants to rapidly, give up or down signals on promising interventions for the imminent public health threat of our time, that, we should learn something ideally from that effort and carry that forward into other domains, including cancers. I mean, there's a lot of benefits from doing that. I think it allows greater enrollment for, particularly for rare diseases. So there are some diseases that are just so rare that it can be difficult to make progress without doing, trials in a multilateral fashion. I think that is often what spurred the pediatric. I mean, in addition to the fact that pediatricians are just nicer than, adult physicians, pediatric cancer in high income countries is a relatively rare condition. And so it created this need to collaborate right from the very beginning in a way that perhaps didn't always exist for breast cancer, colorectal cancer, et cetera, in adult populations. So I think, there's an opportunity to really move the needle forward for rare diseases, and especially diseases that may be rare in high income countries. So one example is HIV-associated malignancies, which primarily occur in sub-Saharan Africa. That has been accrual to the NCI-supported AIDS Malignancy Consortium, which is the dedicated clinical trials network that is focused on that population, has been challenging in the US domestically in recent years. And I think because of that, that group has really sought to expand its representation in sub-Saharan Africa and Latin America in ways that have been really productive. Obviously, it gives you better sample size, power. So I think there's, kind of study design reasons. I think there's also, it gives you the opportunity to test solutions across diverse contexts. I think that leads to better solutions. I mean, knowing that an intervention holds up well in, Bethesda and also in Malawi, I think that speaks to the robustness of that intervention in a way that I think is not spoken to simply by a small trial done in Bethesda. So I think there's this kind of robustness and generalizability aspect that is can only come through these sorts of broad, multilateral, multi-setting kind of trials. I think it also, when you're working in particularly challenging contexts, I think it really forces really innovative solutions. And I think this was alluded to in the earlier panel as well, that I think the reality is that over the near term, delivering the same intensity of therapy for Burkitt lymphoma in Seattle and in Malawi, that's not going to be achievable, you know? And so I think but I think we know enough about Burkitt lymphoma biology and that there's a real opportunity to think about how might we treat this in a different way, where we're not trying to displace, you know, decades of accumulated experience, but can really think outside the box, I guess, even though I tend to sort of hate that phrase. I think we haven't really realized those innovation opportunities. I think there's certainly the equity angle is critically important, you know, creating a minimum standard, as we said at the beginning, below which patients aren't allowed to fall. But there is a real innovation opportunity too, because there's I think kind of this unparalleled opportunity to think about, you know, how can we do this in a completely different setting and, you know, for a completely different patient population. And I think some real innovations will be developed there that can be brought to bear on patients worldwide. And again, I think we're thinking a lot about what the clinical trials portfolio and LMIC should look like, you know, how the NCI can participate and help catalyze that. And, you know, I think we'll have a lot of stuff kind of hopefully happening in this area in, you know, years to come.
Dr. Marte, if I recall, you've had some clinical trial experience in Africa. Do you want to talk about how it gets conducted?
Yeah, so I'm coming more from the implementation science perspective. I definitely do agree that multilateral organizations, it is really a critical need for advancement and generation of, you know, scientific knowledge in sub-Saharan Africa. From my perspective, I think it's really important that some of these trials are actually conducted in Africa, and thinking more about pragmatic trials. And so how do we conduct these trials within the existing conditions? I think there's been a lot of translation of what we know works in high income countries into sub-Saharan Africa, and it hasn't really worked. But how do we use the existing healthcare infrastructure, or just the structure within healthcare is being delivered? And so in implementation science, thinking about existing infrastructure for HIV care delivery, like how do we leverage that to build upon for cancer care delivery? And so moving beyond sort of the efficacy, the efficacy trial, and thinking, is this effective in this setting, and how do we optimize it for this setting? So I think that's absolutely critical. I think the role that multilateral organizations play is critical because research trials and implementation trials involve funding. It involves development of like network systems and building capacity. And I think this is where these partnerships are crucial, really, in ensuring that the studies being performed actually meet, you know, standard regulatory practices stipulated by international agencies. And so trials are ethical, but then also inclusive. And so I think even in the US, we're realizing that, you know, not conducting trials that are not representative of the population that it's intended for is problematic when it comes down to care delivery. And I think in the African context as well, especially thinking about cancer in the next couple of years, where I think in sub-Saharan Africa, it's going to dominate in terms of mortality burden. It's important now to think about how do we, you know, in the generation of knowledge, how do we include the context and the people right from the get-go? And I think there's really a critical need for a shift for clinical trials in Africa. And also sort of pointing to what Dr. Gopal had said, I think when we think about the individual countries and the numbers of cancer diagnosed, I don't think, you know, we have the power to do clinical trials individually in different countries. I think there have been consortiums in the US for like different breast cancer and leukemia trials. And I think similarly, when we think about trials, it's important not only to think about multilateral organizations, sort of global North, global South collaborations, but just thinking about South-South collaborations and how do we form clinical trial networks within the region to actually spur like high quality clinical trials within cancer care delivery.
Challenges. Challenges. So, you know, as I mentioned earlier, a number of the participants in today's academy are representatives of the pharmaceutical and device industries. And obviously they're, as Ms. Kobayashi mentioned earlier, a really important stakeholder and partner in equity efforts. So from your perspective, what can the pharmaceutical and device industry do to assist in global equity of cancer care? If you had your wish list, what would they do as part of this effort?
I think from our experience, again, working across a wide range of health areas, the times that companies have been able to contribute to massive transformations in public health is when they saw their sustainable business opportunity in shifting from models that are high price, low volume to models that are high volume, lower price. And sometimes we've had to help facilitate those types of shifts in the business model. But the key to that is that the companies have to have that drive and that willingness to do what it takes to get their extremely important life-saving products to the patients that need them most. And so some companies, they do that by organizing an access group internally. Others change the metrics that they use to assess their performance, shifting from a focus on profit to a focus on access in certain regions or for certain products. So when companies have that kind of internal motivation, the business economics and the sustainable approaches can be made to work. But it starts with them. And they are, as I've said before, very important partners, and they have what we need, which is those high quality and life-saving products.
Dr. Romero, a number of companies are part of UICC. What can they do for you, and what can they do for global equity and access?
Well, I think in terms of partnerships with the industry, with the pharma company or the device companies, it could help to introduce faster innovations. Actually, when you work with the right stakeholders, where you work with the policymakers, well, everyone around the table understands the objective that we aim for. So it's really introducing and having this advocacy part of the partnership that will bring faster innovation on the ground, not only to access it, but also in terms of research. They have a critical role in innovation, in research, in training also the workforce to their innovation. So industry has a key role on that, and also funding part of the organization. Not talking about UICC, talking about the organizations on the ground, supporting the cancer centers, supporting the community, and the training of people on the ground, the civil society organization. That's a role of the industry that would help to have an access to equitable care, not only for treatment, not only for diagnosis, for prevention. We talk about a lot on treatment and screening, but prevention is also part of that. They have a role to play in prevention. When we talk about lung cancer, when we talk about treatment of lung cancer, there is something just before that, is that the risk factors, decrease the risk factors, raising awareness. They can have a role to play into that, and also end of life care. So all of that, the cancer control continuum should involve everyone, including the industry.
Dr. Marte, what can industry do to help you with your implementation research?
I think my wish list is very long, but I would just say sort of really quickly that when I think about, there's a lot being said about affordable cancer medicines, and I just want to emphasize that I think when people say it affordable, it just doesn't have to be cheaper. It has to match sort of what the income level of the people in the local country are. And so as an example, I know Herceptin, and I think the different pricing programs, but Herceptin used to cost about $32,000 a year for a lot of people in different sub-Saharan African countries. A biosimilar that costs just a few thousands lower it's cheaper technically, but isn't accessible. And so thinking about ways in which we can make these medicines truly affordable, I think there's also an imperative to actually start to collect data on how it actually impacts patients at the point of care. And so I think there was a study published maybe from in the Lancet with Novartis, where they made drugs affordable for like $1 a month, but it didn't change the out-of-pocket cost for patients like over the 2-year period. And so I think in addition to working with governments and local hospitals, it's important to actually, it's imperative to make sure that these organizations that are either whether it's government or whether it's, insurance or whoever it is, there's an imperative that the data is provided to show that these are actually impacting out-of-pocket costs for patients at the point of care. From an implementation perspective, I think industry hasn't really focused a lot on implementation science, and I think there's a huge need to start to think about ways in which we fund researchers and research that is focused on implementation science. And so how do we move from the clinical trial setting into the transitional, thinking about sort of translational research and making these therapies affordable and accessible to patients? Because I think when we think about implementation science is when we actually start to impact care. And I don't think there's been a lot of implementation science trials being done in sub-Saharan Africa, especially within the cancer context. Probably within HIV, there's been a lot, but I think there needs to be a shift on that. There needs to be more technological innovation as well that is very specific to the context. And I think industry has been, I think someone already said, industry has been very critical in driving technological innovations. And so thinking beyond, how do we tailor to a high income market and how do we create innovation that is indigenous to the local context in sub-Saharan Africa, I think will be absolutely critical.
Dr. Gopal.
I don't think I have a lot to add. I mean, I think obviously industry is a critical partner. I guess just to emphasize, I mean, there are obviously decisions that companies make with respect to pricing, intellectual property, et cetera, that have implications for for access related to their products. And I think they should be mindful of that. I think we're seeing that now with COVID vaccines, for example, where many countries are interested in developing manufacturing capacity and are having to work closely with companies to see if that will be allowed. So, the same sets of issues. All of these decisions have implications with respect to access, and it's important to think about them in that way, I think.
Okay. Well, it looks like we've come to the end of our time. Emily Kobayashi, Yehuda Marte, Yannick Romero, Satish Gopal, thank you so much for sharing all of your tremendous experience and expertise and such an engaging conversation. Thank you so much.
We greatly appreciate all of you for attending today. It wouldn't be possible without your attendance. A reminder that we always have our patient guidelines available. They're available for free download via our app or on our website. There's also a small fee available on Amazon to receive a printed copy. This is a great way to share information written from a patient perspective in a way patients can understand and become better informed about their diagnosis and bring better questions to their doctors while they're receiving care. So thank you all again for attending today. We greatly appreciate it. On behalf of the NCCN Global team, Lauren Trevora, Katie Winkworth-Prejnar, Caitlin McCauley, thank you so much for attending. We are always here to reach out if there's any further information you'd like from us. Please do not hesitate. Have a wonderful rest of your day, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Thank you.